There are moments in life when you stand completely alone, facing a crowd that wants to destroy you. For young widow Astrid, that moment comes when her dead husband's mother grabs her by the hair and accuses her of betraying their family honor. The clan hall falls silent as Gudrun the Hollow-Tongued prepares to drag Astrid out into the bitter cold, where no woman survives alone. Astrid has no sons to defend her, no gold to buy protection, and no voice loud enough to speak over the shame. But then something unexpected happens. A giant shadow steps forward from the back of the hall. Gunnar Half-Grave, the most feared warrior in all the north, places his massive hand on Gudrun's wrist and quietly says words that will change everything. The entire assembly holds its breath. Why would this legendary fighter risk his reputation to save a woman he barely knows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the gaps in the longhouse walls like the voices of the restless dead, carrying with it the bite of an early winter that promised months of hardship ahead. Snow had begun to fall in earnest 3 days past, blanketing the settlement of Ironhold in a shroud of white that muffled sound and made the world seem smaller, more dangerous. Inside the great hall of Jarl Magnus, the warmth from the central fire pit did little to chase away the chill that had settled not just in the air, but in the hearts of those gathered for the clan moot. Astrid Kolrundottir pulled her worn woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the edge of the assembly, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her like stones thrown at her back. The simple iron band on her finger, all that remained of her marriage to Eric, felt heavier than a warrior's full armor. 6 months had passed since the fever took her husband. 6 months since the world she knew crumbled like autumn leaves beneath her feet. The ring had once been a symbol of protection, of belonging to something greater than herself. Now it marked her as a woman without a protector, without status, without hope. The great hall stretched before her like a cavern carved from the very mountains that surrounded their settlement. Massive oak beams, blackened by decades of smoke, supported a roof that had weathered countless storms. Along the walls hung the weapons and shields of warriors, both living and dead, their polished surfaces reflecting the dancing flames of the fire. At the far end of the hall, beneath a faded banner bearing the wolf's head of House Kolrun, sat Jarl Magnus on his carved throne, a man whose wisdom had guided their clan through 20 winters of prosperity and war. But it was not the Jarl's weathered face that commanded Astrid's attention now. It was the cluster of accusers who had arranged themselves like vultures around a dying animal, led by the woman who had once called her daughter and now called her betrayer. Gudrun the Hollow-Tongued stood with the authority of a woman who had birthed warriors and buried husbands, her grey hair braided with the bone pins that marked her status as a clan matriarch. Her face, carved by years of harsh winters and harder losses, bore the expression of righteous fury that comes to those who believe themselves the guardians of honor. The woman who had once taught Astrid to weave and brew ale now looked upon her with eyes as cold as the wind outside. She dishonors us all. Gudrun's voice carried across the hall with the practiced cadence of one accustomed to being heard. A widow's duty is to her dead husband's memory, not to the whispered promises of strangers who come bearing silver and lies. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from green wood, acrid and choking. Astrid felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger in equal measure. The clan members who filled the hall, farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and warriors, watched with the fascination of those witnessing a public execution. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, but most wore the careful neutrality of people who knew that taking sides in a family dispute could cost them dearly. Young Bjorn Ironbeard, barely old enough to grow the whiskers that gave him his name, leaned forward on his bench with eager eyes. "What proof do you bring, Gudrun?" Words are wind without substance behind them. Proof? Gudrun's laugh was bitter as winter ale. Ask Sven the smith if he did not see her walking the forest path toward the old trading post 3 nights running. Ask Ingrid Saltborn if she did not hear the Danish words spoken in the darkness beyond the settlement's edge. Ask any who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Astrid's hands trembled as she touched the leather pouch at her belt, the same pouch that had carried her healing herbs to countless bedsides over the years. Inside were dried willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, and the bitter root that could bring down a fever. Simple things that had saved lives and earned her a place of respect among the women of the clan. Now even her skills as a healer seemed tainted by suspicion. "I never," she began, but Gudrun's voice rode over hers like thunder over rain. "Never what, girl? Never met with the Dane who came asking questions about our defenses? Never accepted his silver in exchange for information about our stores and our warriors?" Gudrun reached into her own pouch and withdrew a small object that caught the firelight, a silver coin bearing the mark of a Danish trading house. "This was found in your dwelling, hidden beneath the loose stone by your hearth." The gasps that rose from the assembly felt like physical blows against Astrid's chest. She stared at the coin with genuine confusion, her mind racing to understand how such a thing could have come to be in her home. She had met with the Dane, that much was true, but not for the reasons Gudrun claimed. The truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous to speak aloud. Jarl Magnus raised his hand for silence, and the hall obeyed as it always did when their leader spoke. His voice, weathered by age but still carrying the authority of one who had led men in battle, cut through the tension like a sword through silk. "These are serious accusations, Gudrun. The penalty for betraying clan secrets to outsiders is death or exile. Do you truly wish to see Eric's widow face such a fate?" "Eric's widow?" Gudrun spat. "She dishonored my son's memory the moment she chose her own desires over her duty. A true widow would have thrown herself upon his funeral pyre rather than live to shame his name." The cruelty of the words struck Astrid like a physical blow. She had loved Eric with the fierce devotion of a woman who had found her match in both mind and spirit. They had planned to build something lasting together, a family, a legacy, a love that would endure beyond the brief span of mortal years. His death had torn that future away like a sail ripped from its mast in a storm, leaving her adrift in a world that had no place for a woman without a man's protection. "I loved your son," Astrid said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the hushed hall. "I would never dishonor his memory." "Love?" Gudrun's eyes flashed with contempt. "You loved the comfort he provided, the status of being a warrior's wife. But when death took him, you showed your true nature quick enough. How long did you wait before seeking the company of other men? A month? A week?" The unfairness of it all threatened to choke Astrid like smoke from a green fire. She had waited longer than most widows to even consider her future, spending her days tending to the sick, and her nights remembering every moment of happiness she had shared with Eric. The meeting with the Danish trader had nothing to do with desire or betrayal, but explaining the truth would require revealing secrets that could doom them all. Around the hall, she could see the faces of people she had known all her life turning away from her. Olaf the baker, whose wife she had helped deliver safely of twins. Ragnhild Stormcrow, whose husband's fever she had broken with her herbs. Even young Thor Eriksson, who bore her dead husband's name and had once called her aunt, now looked upon her with uncertainty. The isolation was complete and suffocating. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by the men who protected her, Astrid stood alone against accusations that could see her cast out into the winter cold to die. The clan that had once welcomed her now felt like a trap closing around her, and the people she had served faithfully now sat in judgment of her very right to exist. The faded banner of House Colrun that hung above the Jarl's throne seemed to mock her with its tattered edges and fading colors. Once it had flown proudly over Eric's shield as he rode to war. Now it hung limp and lifeless, much like her own hopes for justice and mercy. Gudrun took a step forward, her hand reaching for Astrid's hair with the deliberate menace of a predator closing for the kill. "Since you will not confess your crimes and beg for mercy, Perhaps a taste of the shame you have brought upon us all will loosen your tongue." The hall held its breath as Gudrun's fingers tangled in Astrid's dark hair, yanking her head back with enough force to bring tears to her eyes. The pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of being handled like a disobedient child before the entire assembly. This was how it would end then, not with the clean death of an honorable warrior, but with the slow strangulation of reputation and dignity until nothing remained but the choice between exile and execution. But as Gudrun's grip tightened, and her voice rose to pronounce the formal words of banishment, a shadow fell across the firelight. A voice deep as mountain stone, and twice as steady, cut through the hall like the blade of a master smith. "Touch her again, and I'll answer with steel, not words." The silence that followed was deeper than the stillness of new snow, as if the very air in the hall had forgotten how to carry sound. Every eye turned toward the massive figure that had emerged from the shadows at the back of the assembly, and even the flames in the fire pit seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Gunnar Half-Grave stood like a mountain given human form, his broad shoulders filling the doorway he had just passed through. The man they called Half-Grave moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had never needed to hurry because death itself waited on his convenience. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, streaked with premature silver that spoke of battles survived and prices paid. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw only added to the aura of barely contained violence that surrounded him like morning mist. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, pale blue like winter ice, holding depths that suggested he had looked upon things that would break lesser men. They fixed upon Gudrun with the unwavering focus of a wolf marking its prey, and the elder woman's grip on Astrid's hair loosened involuntarily. "Gunnar Half-Grave," Jarl Magnus said, his voice carefully neutral, despite the surprise that flickered across his weathered features. "We did not expect you at the moot tonight." "Expectations," Gunnar replied, stepping into the circle of firelight with movements that spoke of absolute confidence, "are for men who have the luxury of certainty. I came because honor demanded it. The hunting knife at Astrid's belt, Eric's knife, the only weapon she carried and the last gift her husband had given her, seemed to grow warm against her hip as Gunnar's presence filled the space around her. The blade had been her constant companion through the dark months of widowhood, a reminder that even in her vulnerability she carried something of her husband's strength. Now with this legendary warrior standing between her and her accusers, she felt that strength echo in the very air. Gudrun's face had gone white as winter bone, but her voice held steady with the stubborn courage of a woman who had faced down raiders and wild beasts in her long life. "This is a family matter, Gunnar. It does not concern you, doesn't it?" He took another step forward, and the sound of his boots on the wooden floor seemed to echo like distant thunder. "When you lay hands on a woman under the protection of clan law, when you seek to destroy her without proof or trial, it becomes a matter for any warrior who values justice." "Protection?" Gudrun's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "She has no protection. Her husband is dead. She has borne no sons, and her own actions have forfeited any claim to our mercy." Gunnar's hand moved to rest on the hilt of the war axe that hung at his side. Not a threat, precisely, but a reminder of what he was capable of. The weapon was legend in its own right, its blade having tasted the blood of enemies from the Irish coast to the Baltic shores. Men spoke of it in whispers around winter fires, telling tales of battles where Gunnar had carved through enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. "You speak of proof," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Show me this proof that condemns her." Gudrun held up the Danish silver coin again, its surface catching the firelight like a small star. This was hidden in her dwelling. Silver from a Danish trader who came asking questions about our defenses. "What more proof do you need?" Gunnar studied the coin with the same attention he might give to an enemy's battle formation, his pale eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Around the hall, the assembled clan members watched with the fascination of spectators at a blood sport. unsure which combatant would emerge victorious, but certain that the outcome would be worth witnessing. "A coin," Gunnar said finally. "Hidden, you say? Tell me, Gudrun the Hollow-Tongued, who found this coin? Who discovered its hiding place?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Astrid saw uncertainty flicker across Gudrun's face for the first time since the accusations began. A crack in the armor of righteous certainty that had protected her until now. "I found it," Gudrun said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. While preparing her dwelling for the cleansing that follows banishment. Preparing for cleansing? Gunnar's eyebrows rose slightly. Before the mood had decided her fate. Before she had been given the chance to defend herself? "It seems you were quite certain of the outcome." Murmurs began to ripple through the assembly like wind through wheat as the implications of Gunnar's questions began to sink in. Astrid felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest, not because she believed herself saved, but because someone was finally asking the right questions. Someone was looking beyond the surface of accusations to the deeper currents beneath. Jarl Magnus leaned forward on his throne, his ancient eyes sharp with interest. "Continue, Gunnar. You clearly have more to say on this matter." "I do." Gunnar turned to face the full assembly, his presence commanding their attention as surely as a scold commanded silence before beginning an epic tale. "I know something of Danish traders and their silver. They do not part with it lightly, and never without receiving something of equal value in return. If this woman truly betrayed our secrets for Danish gold, where is the rest of it? One coin would hardly buy the services of a child, much less information that could threaten an entire settlement." The logic was undeniable, and Astrid saw several clan members nodding thoughtfully. But Gudrun was not finished fighting. "Perhaps she was paid in other ways," the elder woman suggested, her voice thick with implication. "Perhaps the silver was merely a token, a promise of future rewards for future services." "Possible," Gunnar acknowledged, "but unlikely. The Danes I have known prefer to deal in certainties, not promises. They would want proof of value before parting with their treasure." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembly. "But there is another question that troubles me more. Why would a woman risk everything for one coin? Astrid Kolrundottir is many things, but she is not a fool." Astrid's breath caught in her throat as she realized that Gunnar knew her name, spoke it with a familiarity that suggested their paths had crossed before. But when? She could not recall ever meeting this legendary warrior. Could not imagine circumstances that would have brought them together. "You speak as if you know her," Gudrun observed, suspicion creeping into her tone. "I know enough," Gunnar replied cryptically. "I know that she has healing skills that have saved lives in this settlement. I know that she tended the wounded after the raid on Grimsby, asking for nothing in return. I know that she has given this clan far more than she has taken from it." The warmth in his voice, when he spoke of her healing work, sent an unexpected flutter through Astrid's chest. She had not realized that her efforts had been noticed by someone of his stature, had assumed that the powerful men of the clan were aware only of her existence as Eric's widow. "Pretty words," Gudrun snarled, "but they change nothing. The evidence, Gunnar interrupted, is a single coin that could have been placed by anyone, found by someone who admits to searching the dwelling before guilt was established. In any court of law, such evidence would be dismissed as worthless." He took a step closer to Gudrun, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. "But let us say, for the sake of argument, that your accusations are true. Let us say that Astrid Kolrundottir did indeed meet with a Danish trader. The question then becomes why? What could drive a woman known for her loyalty to risk everything? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, and Astrid felt the weight of every gaze upon her once again. But now those gazes held curiosity rather than condemnation. Questions rather than answers. Gunnar turned to face her directly, his pale eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to her soul. Perhaps it is time to hear her side of this tale. Perhaps it is time to ask what she was truly doing in the forest, and why. The invitation to speak hung before her like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But Astrid knew that the truth she carried was more dangerous than any lie Gudrun could tell, more threatening to the clan than any Danish silver. To speak now would be to reveal secrets that could doom them all, but to remain silent would be to accept the fate that her accusers had already decided for her. The choice was hers, and the silence of the hall waited for her answer. The weight of Gunnar's expectation pressed upon Astrid, like the deep waters of a mountain lake, cold and fathomless. She could feel the assembly's attention fixed upon her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, but it was the steady gaze of the giant warrior that held her captive. In those pale blue eyes, she glimpsed something unexpected, not judgment or suspicion, but a kind of patient understanding that suggested he already knew more of her story than she had revealed. His war axe caught the firelight as he shifted slightly, the ancient weapon that had earned him his fearsome reputation gleaming like captured starlight. The blade bore the scars of countless battles, its edge honed to razor sharpness despite the nicks and scratches that spoke of hard use. It was said that Gunnar had taken that axe from the first man he ever killed, a Danish berserker who had thought to claim the young warrior's life on the shores of Lindisfarne. The berserker had learned too late that some men are born to wield death rather than taste it. The stories of Gunnar Half-Grave were legend throughout the north. Tales told around winter fires to make children shiver and warriors aspire to greater deeds. They said he had never lost a battle, never retreated from an enemy, never shown mercy to those who threatened the innocent. His name was whispered in the same breath as the old heroes: Ragnar Lothbrok, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Eric Bloodaxe. But unlike those ancient warriors, Gunnar still walked among the living, still drew breath in a world that seemed too small to contain his presence. Yet standing here in the firelight, watching him defend a woman he claimed barely to know, Astrid began to wonder if the stories captured only part of the truth. There was something in his bearing that spoke of honor deeper than battle glory, of principles that guided him beyond the simple desire for fame and plunder that drove so many warriors. "I asked you a question," Gunnar said gently, his voice carrying none of the threat that had colored his words to Gudrun. "What were you truly doing in the forest?" Astrid's mouth felt dry as winter bark. Around her, the clan members leaned forward with the anticipation of spectators at a particularly dramatic Skald's performance. She could see Bjorn Ironbeard's young face bright with curiosity. Old Olaf, the baker's weathered features creased with concern. Even Jarl Magnus had straightened on his throne, his ancient eyes bright with interest, but it was Gudrun's expression that gave her the most pause. The elder woman's face had gone carefully blank, the kind of studied neutrality that came to those who had something important to hide. Her grip on the Danish coin had tightened until her knuckles showed white, and there was a tension in her posture that spoke of a predator suddenly uncertain of its prey. Astrid began, then stopped as the magnitude of what she was about to reveal struck her anew. To speak the truth would be to condemn them all, to reveal a threat so dire that the clan's very survival hung in the balance. Yet to remain silent would be to accept exile or death for crimes she had not committed. "Speak freely," Gunnar encouraged, and something in his tone suggested that he already suspected what she was about to say. The truth, however difficult, is always preferable to comfortable lies. Astrid drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of Eric's knife at her hip like an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Her husband had been a man of honor, a warrior who valued truth above personal comfort. If he were here now, he would tell her to speak, regardless of the consequences. "I met with the Danish trader," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the hushed hall. "But not for the reasons Gudrun claims." The admission sent a ripple of movement through the assembly, but Gunnar raised his hand for silence before anyone could speak. "Continue. He brought warnings," Astrid said, the words coming faster now, as if speaking them aloud could somehow lessen their terrible weight. "Information about forces gathering to the south, about plans being made against our settlement." He said. She glanced at Gudrun, seeing the elder woman's face go ashen. He said there were those within our own clan who had been feeding information to our enemies. The explosion of voices that followed was like the roar of breaking waves against stone. Clan members shouted questions and accusations, some leaping to their feet in alarm, others pointing fingers at neighbors they had trusted for years. Only Gunnar remained still in the chaos, his pale eyes fixed on Astrid with an intensity that seemed to cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Silence. Jarl Magnus's voice cracked like a whip, bringing order back to the hall through decades of practiced authority. Let her finish speaking before we dissolve into madness. Astrid's hands were trembling now, but she forced herself to continue. The trader, his name was Leif Erikson, said that someone in Ironhold had been providing detailed information about our defenses, our food stores, the numbers and placement of our warriors. He said the information was being sold to a coalition of enemy clans who planned to attack before the deep winter set in. And why? Gudrun's voice cut through the renewed murmurs like a blade through flesh. Would a Danish trader warn us of such a plot? What interest would he have in our survival? It was the question Astrid had dreaded, the one that cut closest to the heart of the terrible truth. Because, she said, meeting Gudrun's gaze directly, his information came from someone who regretted their betrayal. Someone who wanted to undo the damage they had done before it was too late. The implication hung in the air, like smoke from a green fire, acrid and choking. Astrid saw understanding dawn on several faces around the hall, watched as suspicion began to shift like sand in an hourglass. But it was Gunnar's reaction that surprised her most. Not shock or anger, but a kind of grim satisfaction, as if a puzzle he had been working had finally revealed its solution. "This trader," Gunnar said thoughtfully, "did he give you any proof of his claims? Any evidence that such a betrayal was real?" Astrid nodded, reaching into her healing pouch with hands that still shook slightly. From its depths, she withdrew a small piece of parchment, its edges singed as if it had been rescued from a fire. "He gave me this, a copy of a message that had been sent to the enemy clans, detailing our winter preparations." Gunnar took the parchment with the careful reverence of a man handling a blade, unfolding it slowly as the hall watched in breathless silence. His pale eyes scanned the contents, and Astrid saw his jaw tighten with controlled fury. "This," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet, "describes our defenses with accuracy that could only come from someone with intimate knowledge of our preparations. Someone who sat in on the war council meetings. Someone who had access to information known only to our most trusted leaders." The weight of that revelation settled over the hall like a heavy shroud, and Astrid saw more than one clan member glance nervously at their neighbors. In a settlement where trust was the foundation of survival, the suggestion that one of their own had betrayed them was more devastating than any enemy attack. And through it all, Gudrun the Hollow-Tongued stood silent as stone, her face a mask that revealed nothing of the thoughts churning. Beneath, the parchment in Gunnar's hands seemed to burn with invisible fire as the implications of its contents settled over the assembly like ash from a distant volcano. Astrid watched the faces around her transform from suspicion to shock, to the kind of cold fury that comes when trust is shattered like ice beneath a heavy boot. The leather healing pouch at her belt felt warm against her hip, its familiar weight a reminder of all the times she had used its contents to mend what was broken, to heal what was wounded. But some wounds, she realized, got too deep for any herb or salve to reach. "Read it aloud," Jarl Magnus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Let every member of this clan hear what has been done in our name." Gunnar's pale eyes met the Jarl's steadily before he began to read, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "To Hakon Blood-Eagle and the war chiefs of the Southern Alliance, the settlement of Ironhold maintains 37 fighting men, of whom 12 are currently absent on trading missions. Their grain stores would sustain a siege of no more than 6 weeks. The weak point in their defenses lies on the eastern approach, where the old landslide has left the palisade walls lower and more easily scaled. Each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and anger through the assembled clan members. Astrid saw Bjorn Ironbeard's young face flush with rage, watched as Olaf the baker's hands clenched into fists that spoke of a desire to strangle whoever had written such words. "There is more," Gunnar continued, his voice growing harder with each sentence. "The Jarl's War Council meets every third night in the back chamber of the Great Hall. The guards change at midnight and again at dawn, and there are never more than 2 posted at any given time. The smith's forge could be made useless by destroying the bellows, which are stored in the shed behind his dwelling." The level of detail was devastating in its precision, revealing knowledge that could only have come from someone with access to the clan's most closely guarded secrets. Astrid felt sick to her stomach as she realized how complete the betrayal had been, how thoroughly their enemy had been prepared to destroy everything they held dear. Who else knew of these details? Gunnar asked, looking directly at Jarl Magnus. Who sat in those war council meetings? The Jarl's weathered face had gone grey as winterstone, but his voice remained steady. "Myself, my son Ragnar, Thorstein the smith, Olaf Beardcutter who leads our warriors," and his eyes moved to Gudrun, and Astrid saw understanding dawn like a terrible sunrise. "And the clan mothers who provide for our provisioning." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackle of flames in the fire pit and the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. Every eye in the hall turned toward Gudrun, but the elder woman's face remained a mask of stone, revealing nothing. "This proves nothing," Gudrun said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of suspicion falling upon her. "Anyone could have written such a document. Anyone could have observed our routines and made educated guesses about our preparations." "Perhaps," Gunnar acknowledged, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was far from finished. "But there is one detail in this message that gives me pause. It mentions that the guards change at midnight and again at dawn, but that schedule was only implemented 3 weeks ago after reports of strange tracks found near the outer perimeter. Only those present at the most recent war council would know of that change." Astrid remembered that night clearly, remembered the tension in Eric's voice when he had returned from the council meeting with news of the new precautions. Her husband had been troubled by something more than simple security concerns, had spent the evening sharpening his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for battle. "Eric suspected something," she said suddenly, the memory crystallizing with painful clarity. "The night before he died, he told me that someone was watching us, that things were being discussed in the war council that made their way to the wrong ears too quickly." Gunnar nodded grimly. "Your husband was a smart man. What else did he tell you?" He said." Astrid paused, trying to recall Eric's exact words through the haze of grief and time. "He said that loyalty was being tested, and that some tests revealed more about the testers than the tested. I didn't understand what he meant then, but you do now," Gunnar observed. Astrid's eyes moved to Gudrun, seeing the elder woman in a new and terrible light. He suspected his own mother, the woman who raised him, who taught him honor and duty and love of clan. He suspected her of betraying everything they had built together. The accusation hit the hall like a thunderclap, and several clan members rose to their feet in shock and outrage. But it was Gudrun's reaction that confirmed Astrid's growing certainty, not denial or anger, but a kind of weary resignation that spoke of someone whose carefully constructed lies were finally crumbling. "You have no proof," Gudrun said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The ravings of a dead man, interpreted by a widow desperate to save herself. What court would accept such evidence?" "The court of truth," Gunnar replied quietly. "The court that sits in every man's heart and judges based on what the eyes see and the mind knows to be real." He stepped closer to Gudrun, his massive frame casting her in shadow. "Tell me, honored mother, how did you know where to find that Danish coin? How did you know exactly which stone to look beneath in Astrid's dwelling?" The question was like an arrow shot at close range, finding its target with devastating accuracy. Gudrun's face went white as new snow, and for the first time since the accusations began, she looked truly afraid. "I searched thoroughly," she said, but the words came out weak and unconvincing. As any loyal clan member would when investigating treachery. Did you? Gunnar's voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Or did you know where to look because you put it there yourself? Did you plant evidence against the woman you sought to destroy, hoping to cover your own tracks with her blood? The hall erupted in angry voices as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. But through the chaos, Astrid heard something else, the sound of footsteps moving toward the door, the whisper of fabric against wood as someone tried to slip away unnoticed. Gudrun the Hollow-Tongued was running, and her flight was confession enough for any court that valued truth over comfortable lies. Gunnar moved with the fluid grace of a hunting wolf as Gudrun fled toward the great hall's entrance, his long strides covering ground with deceptive ease. The bone pendant at his throat, carved in the shape of a raven with wings spread wide, caught the firelight as he moved, its ancient surface worn smooth by years of wear. The pendant marked him as one of Odin's chosen, a warrior who had walked the knife's edge between life and death so many times that the All-Father himself had taken notice. "Stop her," Jarl Magnus commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sword through silk. "Let none leave this hall until we have the full truth." But Gunnar was already moving, his powerful frame cutting through the crowd of agitated clan members like a ship's prow through rough seas. Gudrun had nearly reached the doorway when his massive hand fell upon her shoulder, stopping her flight as surely as if she had struck a mountain. "Running confirms guilt more surely than any confession," Gunnar said quietly, his pale eyes boring into hers with the intensity of winter starlight. "Would you flee into the night rather than face the consequences of your choices?" Gudrun turned slowly, and Astrid was shocked to see that the elder woman's face had aged a decade in the span of minutes. The proud matriarch, who had once commanded respect through sheer force of will, now looked like what she truly was, an old woman whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around her. "Ears, you understand nothing," Gudrun said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing of what I sacrificed, what I endured, what I gave up to keep this clan alive." "Then enlighten us," Jarl Magnus said, rising from his throne with the careful movements of a man whose joints had felt too many winters. "Tell us how betraying our secrets to enemy clans served the greater good." The hall had grown quiet again, the kind of tense silence that precedes either confession or violence. Astrid found herself studying Gudrun's face with new eyes, seeing past the mask of righteousness to the desperate woman beneath. There were shadows there she had never noticed before, lines carved by worry and sleepless nights, the weight of secrets that had grown too heavy for one person to carry. "My son is dead," Gudrun said finally, her voice cracking like ice under spring sun. "Dead because he trusted the wrong people, because he believed in honor and loyalty when he should have believed in survival." "Eric died of fever," Astrid protested, confusion coloring her words. "I tended him myself. I saw no signs of poison or violence." Gudrun's laugh was bitter as winter ale left too long in the cold. "Fever, yes, but not the kind that comes from nature's hand. The kind that comes from eating grain laced with ergot. Grain that was specifically set aside for the War Council's private stores." The revelation hit the hall like a physical blow, and Astrid felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Eric had been poisoned, murdered by someone he trusted, someone who had access to the clan's most carefully guarded supplies. "You're saying someone in the War Council killed my son?" Jarl Magnus's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that comes before the storm breaks in all its fury. "I'm saying that there are forces at work here larger than petty clan disputes," Gudrun replied, her composure cracking further with each word. "Powers that see our settlement as an obstacle to their greater plans. Eric discovered their agents among us, began asking questions that made them nervous." Gunnar's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "So you decided to join them rather than fight them?" "I decided to survive," Gudrun snapped, some of her old fire returning. "When they came to me with offers of gold and guarantees that certain members of the clan would be spared if I cooperated, I chose to protect what I could, rather than lose everything to stubborn pride. The logic was cold and practical. The reasoning of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in noble gestures or heroic last stands. But it was also the logic of someone who had forgotten that some things were worth dying for. And Astrid, Gunnar asked, how did she fit into your plans for survival? Gudrun's eyes flicked to the young widow with something that might have been regret. She was asking too many questions, getting too close to the truth. The Danish trader, Leif Erikson, he was supposed to recruit her as another agent, but instead he warned her about the conspiracy. When my contacts learned of his betrayal, they demanded proof of my continued loyalty. So you decided to sacrifice her, Gunnar said, his voice carrying the kind of judgment that came from a man who had never compromised his honor for convenience. I decided to give them a scapegoat, Gudrun corrected. Better one woman should suffer than an entire clan should burn. The planted evidence, the accusations, it would have been quick, relatively merciful. Exile rather than the slow torture that awaits us all when the enemy comes. Astrid felt sick to her stomach as the full scope of Gudrun's betrayal became clear. Not just the selling of secrets, but the cold calculation that had marked her for death to protect a conspiracy built on murder and greed. When? Jarl Magnus asked, his voice hollow with the weight of terrible knowledge. When do they come? Gudrun was silent for a long moment, her shoulders sagging as if the burden of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. Soon, she said finally, before the first true snowfall, when travel becomes difficult and we would be trapped within our walls. The plan was to attack during the feast of the winter moon, when our guard would be down and our warriors deep in their cups. The feast was only 5 days away, Astrid realized with growing horror. 5 days to prepare for an attack that had been planned with intimate knowledge of their defenses, their routines, their weaknesses. How many? Gunnar asked. 300 warriors from 5 different clans, all united by promises of plunder and land. Led by Hakon Blood Eagle himself, Gudrun's voice was barely audible now. They know exactly where to strike, exactly when our defenses will be weakest. The numbers were devastating. Against 300 seasoned warriors, their own 37 fighting men would be outnumbered more than 8 to 1. It would not be a battle, it would be a massacre. But as Astrid looked around the hall at the faces of her clanmates, she saw not despair, but determination. These were people who had survived raids and famines, harsh winters and political upheavals. They had built something worth defending, and they would not surrender it without a fight. And standing among them, his raven pendant, catching the firelight like a promise of victory, was a warrior whose legend was built on impossible odds and unexpected triumphs. The winter wind had picked up outside the great hall, rattling the heavy oak doors and sending drafts through gaps that made the flames dance like restless spirits. But it was the memory that suddenly blazed to life in Astrid's mind that made her blood run cold, a recollection so vivid it felt like stepping back through time itself. 3 winters passed. The worst blizzard anyone could remember, with snow falling so thick it turned day to twilight and made even the strongest men lose their way between buildings. She had been tending to old Bjorn Stormcrow's broken leg when the pounding came at her door. Desperate, urgent, the sound of someone fighting against time itself. The man she had dragged inside was more dead than alive. His clothes frozen to his body, his skin white as fresh snow where frostbite had begun its cruel work. Blood had soaked through makeshift bandages wrapped around a sword wound that ran from his shoulder to his ribs, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of internal injuries that could prove fatal. She had not asked his name in those moments between life and death. Such things mattered less than stopping the bleeding and warming the frozen flesh before gangrene could set in. For 3 days and nights she had fought for his life, feeding him broth when he could swallow, cleaning his wounds with honey and herbs, using every skill her mother had taught her, and several she had learned through desperate improvisation. The bloodied cloak that had been wrapped around him still hung in her memory like a banner of that desperate time. It was torn and stained beyond saving, but something about its weave had marked it as belonging to a man of means, perhaps even nobility. She had used it to keep him warm during the worst of his fever, when his body had shaken with chills that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. They had talked during those long nights when sleep eluded them both. She because she feared he might slip away if she looked away, he because pain made rest impossible. His voice had been rough with injury and exhaustion, but there had been something in his words that spoke of education, of a man who had seen much of the world beyond their small settlement. He had told her stories of distant lands and strange customs, of battles fought on foreign shores, and the weight of command in desperate situations. She had shared her knowledge of healing herbs and the old songs her grandmother had taught her, the ones that were said to hold power over fever and pain. But it was the conversations about honor and duty that she remembered most clearly now. The way his pale eyes had fixed on hers, with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to her soul. A man's worth, he had said during one of those dark hours before dawn, is not measured by the enemies he defeats or the treasure he accumulates. It is measured by what he is willing to sacrifice for those who cannot protect themselves. She had thought it the wisdom of a warrior facing his own mortality, the kind of deep truth that emerges when a man stands on the threshold between life and death. Now, watching Gunnar Half-Grave command the great hall with quiet authority, she began to understand that she had been listening to something far more personal, a code of honor that had guided every choice he had made since. "You remember now," Gunnar said quietly, his voice cutting through her reverie like a blade through silk. He had been watching her with those same pale eyes, reading the recognition that dawned across her features like sunrise over winter mountains. Astrid nodded slowly, her throat tight with emotion she could not quite name. "The winter of the great storm. You were dying." "I was," he confirmed, stepping closer until she could see the faint scar that ran along his jaw, one of many marks left by that terrible night. Ambushed by Danish raiders while returning from a trading mission. Left for dead in a snowbank 3 miles from here. The hall had grown quiet around them, clan members straining to hear this unexpected revelation. Even Gudrun had stopped struggling against the men who held her, her eyes fixed on the unfolding scene with something that might have been wonder. "You saved my life," Gunnar continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. "Asked for nothing in return, expected no reward or recognition. When I was strong enough to travel, you sent me on my way with provisions and healing salves, refusing even to tell me your name." "I thought you were just another wounded warrior," Astrid whispered, memory flooding back with painful clarity. "I never knew, never suspected that I was Gunnar Half-Grave." He smiled, and the expression transformed his usually stern features into something almost gentle. "Good. It means you saved me for the right reasons, not because of who I was, but because of who you are." Jarl Magnus leaned forward on his throne, his ancient eyes bright with interest. "This explains much about your intervention tonight. The debt of a life saved is not one a man of honor takes lightly. It explains part of it," Gunnar acknowledged. "But not all. The debt of life for life was paid the moment I stood between her and her accusers. What remains now is something deeper." He turned to face the assembled clan members, his presence commanding their absolute attention. "In those 3 days when she fought to keep me alive, I learned more about true courage than in 20 years of warfare. I saw a woman risk everything to save a stranger, knowing that harboring a wounded warrior could bring deadly attention to her door. The truth of it settled over Astrid like a warm cloak, filling spaces in her heart she had not even realized were empty. The mysterious connection she had felt to this legendary warrior, the sense that their paths had crossed before, it all made sense now. "But there is more to this tale," Gunnar said, his voice growing harder as he returned his attention to Gudrun. "Because the ambush that nearly killed me was not a chance encounter with raiders. It was a planned attack, carried out by men who knew exactly where I would be and when." Gudrun's face went white as fresh snow, and Astrid saw understanding dawn like a terrible sunrise. The conspiracy was older than any of them had suspected, its roots reaching back years into the past. "You," Gunnar said, his pale eyes boring into Gudrun's with the intensity of winter starlight. "You were feeding information to our enemies even then. The trading mission routes, the timing of departures and returns. How many good men died because of your betrayals?" The Danish trade token felt warm in Gunnar's palm as he studied its surface with the careful attention of a man reading runes of prophecy. The silver coin bore the mark of House Eriksson, not the common merchant stamp that might be found in any trading post, but the personal seal of Danish nobility. This was no ordinary payment for information. It was a token of alliance between powers far greater than a simple conspiracy of local clans. "Tell me about this Leif Eriksson," Gunnar said to Astrid, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded battlefields from the Irish coast to the Baltic shores. "Describe him carefully, his appearance, his manner of speaking, anything that might mark him as more than a simple trader." Astrid closed her eyes, calling up the memory of that fateful meeting in the forest clearing. "Tall, but not as tall as you. Fair-haired, with a beard braided in the Danish fashion. He spoke our tongue well, but with an accent that marked him as highborn. His hands—" She paused, remembering something that had seemed odd at the time. His hands were soft, unmarked by the calluses that come from handling rope or oar. More like a man who commands others to do such work. "A nobleman masquerading as a merchant," Gunnar mused, turning the coin over in his fingers. But why would Danish nobility involve themselves in what appears to be a local dispute between clans? The question hung in the air like smoke from green wood, acrid and full of hidden meanings. Around the hall, clan members shifted uncomfortably as they began to grasp the implications of what was being revealed. This was not simply a matter of enemy clans seeking plunder or territory. This was something far more dangerous, Jarl. Magnus rose from his throne with the careful movements of a man whose joints had felt too many winters, but whose mind remained sharp as any blade. "Gudrun," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will tell us everything, the full scope of this conspiracy, the true identity of your Danish contact, and what larger game is being played here." Gudrun's shoulders sagged, as if the burden of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the hushed hall. "Leif Eriksson is no trader," she said finally. "He is the bastard son of King Harald Bluetooth, sent to secure the northern territories for Danish expansion. The attacks on our settlement and others like it are not raids for plunder. They are the first moves in a campaign of conquest." The revelation hit the assembly like a thunderclap, and several clan members rose to their feet in shock and alarm. Astrid felt the world tilt beneath her as she realized the true scope of what they faced. Not just 300 raiders seeking gold and slaves, but the advance guard of a Danish army that would reshape the entire northern territories. "The meeting in the forest," Astrid said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "He wasn't trying to recruit me as a spy. He was warning me that the conquest was coming, whether we cooperated or not. It was giving me a chance to save some part of our people." Gunnar nodded grimly. "A bastard prince playing both sides, hedging his bets in case the conquest fails. If the Danish forces succeed, he claims credit for gathering intelligence. If they fail, he can point to his warnings as proof of his loyalty to the conquered peoples. But why warn us at all?" Bjorn Ironbeard asked, his young voice cracking with the strain of trying to understand adult treachery. "What does he gain by helping his father's enemies?" It was Gudrun who answered, her voice thick with bitter knowledge. "Because Harald Bluetooth has legitimate sons who stand to inherit his throne. A bastard's only hope of advancement lies in proving himself more valuable than his brothers, and sometimes that means preserving what they would destroy." The political implications were staggering. If the Danish crown was planning a full conquest of the northern territories, then every settlement, every clan, every independent community was at risk. The attack on Ironhold was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign that would leave nothing unchanged in its wake. "How many other settlements have been compromised?" Gunnar asked. "How far does this conspiracy reach?" Gudrun's laugh was bitter as winter ale left too long in the cold. "Farther than you know. Every major settlement between here and the Danish border has been infiltrated, their defenses mapped, their leaders identified and targeted. The attack on Ironhold is meant to be the signal for a coordinated assault that will crush resistance before it can organize." The magnitude of the betrayal was breathtaking in its scope. Years of careful planning, patient infiltration, and methodical preparation had gone into a strategy that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. The Danish crown had not simply decided to raid their neighbors, they had crafted a plan for complete domination. "Eric discovered this," Astrid said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. "That's why he was killed. He learned about the larger conspiracy and threatened to expose it. My son was always too clever for his own good," Gudrun said with something that might have been pride or regret. He began asking questions about the increased activity along the trade routes, about why so many merchants were suddenly interested in our defenses. When he started investigating the connection between these traders and the enemy clans gathering to the south, he became a threat that had to be eliminated. The ergot poisoning that had killed Eric was not a random act of violence, but a calculated assassination designed to remove a dangerous investigator. The fever that had claimed his life was as political as any sword thrust, as deliberate as any arrow shot in battle. "And the evidence planted in my dwelling?" Astrid asked. "The silver coin that was meant to condemn me." "Insurance," Gudrun replied. "If questions continued to be asked about Eric's death, you would be revealed as the traitor, a grieving widow who had sold her loyalty for Danish gold. Your execution would provide closure, end the investigation, and protect the real conspiracy." The cold calculation behind it all was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire revelation. Astrid's life had been measured against the convenience of foreign powers and found expendable. Her death planned as casually as one might plan a hunting expedition. But as she looked around the hall at the faces of her clanmates, people she had healed and helped, friends who had shared her joys and sorrows, she saw not defeat but determination. The knowledge of what they faced was terrible, but it was also liberating. No longer would they fight shadows and whispers. They knew their enemy now, understood the scope of the threat, and could plan accordingly. 5 days, Gunnar said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of conversation that had begun to rise around the hall. "We have 5 days to prepare for an attack that has been years in the planning. 5 days to turn the tables on enemies who believe they have already won." He turned to face the assembled clan members, his pale eyes bright with the fire of challenge accepted. "They know our defenses, our numbers, our routines, but they do not know that we know they are coming. That ignorance will be their weakness and our strength." The transformation in the hall was palpable. Fear giving way to resolve as the impossible odds began to seem less like a death sentence and more like an opportunity for legend. These were people who had survived everything the harsh northern lands could throw at them, and now they would face their greatest test with eyes wide open and weapons sharp. The Danish trade token in Gunnar's hand caught the firelight like a promise of battle to come. Ancient signal horn that hung above Jarl. Magnus's throne had not been sounded in living memory, its carved surface blackened by age and polished smooth by countless hands. Legend claimed it had been crafted from the horn of the great auroch that Jarl Eriksson had slain when first establishing the settlement, and that its call could rally warriors from distances that would take a swift horse half a day to cover. Now, as dawn approached and the reality of their situation settled over the clan like a heavy cloak, that horn represented their only hope of survival. Gunnar stood before the great map that covered the western wall of the hall, its parchment surface marked with ink that had faded to brown with age. The settlement of Ironhold was represented by a small cluster of buildings at the center, surrounded by the natural barriers that had made it defensible for 3 generations. To the south, red marks indicated the positions where enemy forces were likely. Gathering information gleaned from Gudrun's reluctant confessions and cross-referenced with reports from hunters and traders who had noticed unusual activity in recent weeks. 37. "Fighting men," Gunnar said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall where clan members had gathered to hear his assessment. "Against 300 seasoned warriors who know our defenses better than we know them ourselves." The odds were staggering, but Astrid had seen something change in the faces around her as the night progressed. Where fear had once dominated, she now saw the kind of grim determination that came to people who had nothing left to lose and everything worth defending. These were not just warriors and farmers, they were fathers and mothers, craftsmen and healers, people who had built something precious in this harsh land and would not surrender it without a fight. However, Gunnar continued, turning from the map to face the assembly, "They expect to find us unprepared, divided by internal strife, and weakened by the very accusations that brought us together tonight. They do not know that their spy has been exposed, their plans revealed, and their advantage of surprise eliminated," Thorstein the smith, his massive frame made even more imposing by the leather apron he wore, even to clan meetings, stepped forward from the crowd. "What do you propose, Gunnar Half-Grave? How do we turn knowledge into victory?" It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of their desperate situation. Knowledge of the enemy's plans was valuable, but it could not add warriors to their ranks or strengthen walls that had been built for defense against raids, not sieges. Gunnar smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded Astrid of the stories told about berserkers before battle, men who found joy in impossible odds because they offered the chance to achieve immortality through deed rather than years. "We use their own strategy against them," he said. "They plan to attack during the feast of the winter moon, when our guard is down and our warriors deep in their cups. Instead, we will give them exactly what they expect to see, a settlement celebrating in blissful ignorance of the danger approaching from the south." Jarl Magnus leaned forward on his throne, his ancient eyes sharp with interest. "Explain. We prepare our defenses in secret while maintaining the appearance of normal preparation for the winter feast. When the attack comes, they will find not drunken revelers, but armed warriors ready for battle." Gunnar's pale eyes swept across the assembled faces. "But more than that, we will use their knowledge of our routines to lead them into traps." The strategy was audacious in its simplicity, relying on the enemy's confidence in their intelligence to blind them to the possibility of deception. Astrid found herself remembering Eric's words about the best traps being the ones that use the prey's own nature against it. The weak point in the eastern wall that Gudrun's intelligence identified, Gunnar continued, pointing to the relevant section on the map. "We will make it appear even weaker, drawing their main assault to that position while concealing our true strength elsewhere." Young Bjorn Ironbeard's eyes lit up with understanding. "A killing ground. Channel them into a narrow approach where numbers become a disadvantage rather than strength." "Precisely," Gunnar nodded approvingly. "But that will only work if we can convince them that we remain ignorant of their plans. Which means Gudrun must appear to escape, must seem to flee in the night carrying word that her accusations were dismissed and Astrid cleared of all suspicion." The proposal sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. Several voices rose in protest at the idea of allowing the traitor to go free, but Gunnar raised his hand for silence. "She will not truly escape," he said. "But she must appear to do so, must seem to carry intelligence that confirms their expectations. Only then will they proceed with their original plan rather than adapting to new circumstances." The tactical wisdom was sound, but Astrid could see the emotional difficulty it presented for clan members who had trusted Gudrun for years, only to discover her betrayal. The desire for immediate justice warred with the practical necessity of using that betrayal as a weapon against their enemies. What of the other settlements? asked Ragnhild Stormcrow, her weathered face creased with concern. If this is truly a coordinated attack, should we not warn them? It was Jarl Magnus who answered, his voice heavy with the weight of hard decisions. We cannot. Any warning sent now would alert the enemy that their conspiracy has been discovered. Our only hope is to defeat the force sent against us so thoroughly that it disrupts their larger plan. The burden of that responsibility settled over the hall like a shroud. They were not simply fighting for their own survival, but for the freedom of every settlement, every clan, every independent community in the Northern Territories. If they failed, the Danish conquest would proceed unopposed. If they succeeded, they might shatter a plan years in the making. I need volunteers, Gunnar said, his voice cutting through the weight of contemplation. Men and women willing to risk everything on a plan that offers no guarantees beyond the chance to die with honor. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors stepped forward without hesitation, but so did craftsmen, farmers, even some of the clan mothers whose sons were too young to fight. Astrid found herself moving before conscious thought had formed. Her hand rising to volunteer services she hoped would be needed when the battle was done. Gunnar's eyes found hers across the crowd, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond the formal obligations of honor debt or clan loyalty. In that moment, she saw not the legendary warrior whose name was spoken in whispers around winter fires, but the wounded man she had nursed back to life. The patient who had talked through long nights about duty and sacrifice and the price of doing what was right. Astrid, he said, his voice gentle despite the gravity of their situation. I would ask you to take the greatest risk of all. She nodded without hesitation, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Name it. When the attack comes, you must be ready to tend the wounded, not just our own, but theirs as well. Some of the enemy warriors may be men pressed into service against their will, farmers and fishermen forced to fight by lords who care nothing for their lives. If we show mercy to those who deserve it, we may gain allies among our enemies. The wisdom of the strategy was clear, but so was its danger. Tending enemy wounded would require moving through the battlefield during combat, exposing herself to arrows and blades from both sides. It would mean trusting that warriors caught up in battle fury would recognize her healer's marks and spare her life. I understand, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a cold serpent. Around the hall, other assignments were being made with the swift efficiency of a war council that knew time was their most precious resource. Thorstein would prepare special weapons, caltrops to scatter in the killing ground, fire arrows to ignite the enemy's siege equipment. Olaf the baker would coordinate the non-combatants, ensuring that food and medical supplies were positioned where they would be needed most. But it was the final preparation that would be most crucial, the careful choreography of appearing normal while preparing for war, of maintaining routines that had been observed and reported, while secretly transforming those routines into instruments of destruction. As the eastern sky began to show the first grey hints of dawn, Astrid realized that this might be the last peaceful morning any of them would see. In 5 days, the feast of the winter moon would begin, and with it would come the test that would determine whether Ironhold remained free or fell under the dominion of foreign lords who saw their people as obstacles to be cleared, rather than human beings to be cherished. The signal horn above the Jarl's throne seemed to gleam in the firelight, waiting for the moment when its ancient voice would sound across the valley, calling all who heard it to stand together against the darkness that was coming. The morning of the winter moon feast dawned grey and bitter, with clouds hanging low over the settlement like a shroud of foreboding. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, muffling sound and turning the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. But it was not the weather that made Astrid's breath catch in her throat as she stood. Watch from the eastern wall. It was the dark line moving across the distant hills like a shadow given Malevolent life, the enemy had come, the shield wall that formed iron holds. Primary defense was a thing of beauty and terror. 37 warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, with their shields overlapping like the scales of some great dragon. Each man knew his place, knew the rhythm of advance and retreat that would keep the formation intact even under the most desperate pressure. Gunnar stood at the center, his massive frame anchoring the line like the root of a great tree, his war axe gleaming with the promise of violence to come. The sight of that formation, so small against the approaching tide of enemies, yet so perfect in its discipline, filled Astrid with a pride that burned like fire in her chest. These were her people, her clan, her family in all the ways that mattered. They stood not because they believed they would survive, but because they believed in something worth dying for. 300, Bjorn Ironbeard called from his position on the watchtower, his young voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Maybe more. They're moving in 3 columns, just as Gudrun said they would. The enemy force spread across the valley floor like a plague of locusts, their weapons and armor catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky. They moved with the confident swagger of men who believed themselves already victorious, their formation loose and careless. Why should they worry about discipline when facing an enemy outnumbered 8-1? Gunnar's voice rang out over the settlement, strong and clear as the call of a war horn. Remember, let them come to the eastern wall. Let them believe they have found our weakness. When the horn sounds, that weakness becomes their doom. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The apparent breach in the eastern defenses had been carefully prepared to funnel the attacking force into a narrow killing ground where their superior numbers would become a liability. Hidden archers waited in concealed positions, their arrows aimed at predetermined points along the enemy approach. Caltrops had been scattered where they would be invisible beneath the fresh snow, but devastating to charging warriors. But first, the enemy had to take the bait. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part, watching the approaching force deploy with methodical precision while maintaining the pretense of panic and confusion. Women and children ran through the settlement carrying bundles and crying out in fear, but their terror was carefully choreographed, designed to convince watching enemies that Ironhold had been caught completely unprepared. Archers in position, called Thorstein from his concealed pit near the smithy. The massive blacksmith had traded his hammer for a bow, his thick fingers surprisingly deft on the string. Around the settlement, other voices confirmed readiness. Warriors who had spent 5 days preparing for this moment. Non-combatants who had accepted roles that might cost them their lives. The enemy vanguard reached the outer perimeter of the settlement just as the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the snow-covered ground. The Danish banner that flew above their formation showed Harald Bluetooth's raven, but Astrid could see other symbols as well. The wolves of Clan Ironbane, the crossed axes of the Bloodstone Brotherhood, the serpent of House Grimwald. This was indeed the coordinated assault Gudrun had described, a coalition of enemies united by promises of plunder and Danish gold. At their head rode a figure that could only be Hakon Blood-Eagle himself, his reputation for cruelty preceding him like the stench of carrion. The man was enormous, even by warrior standards, his armor blackened by fire and stained with the blood of countless victims. The axe he carried was nearly as large as Gunnar's, its blade notched from battles that had made his name a curse throughout the northern territories. Ironhold. Hakon's voice boomed across the settlement, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley. We come in the name of King Harald Bluetooth. Surrender now, and some of you may live to serve your new masters. The offer was meant to break morale, to plant seeds of doubt and desperation in the minds of defenders who already knew they were outnumbered. But instead of fear, Astrid heard something else ripple through the settlement, laughter. Quiet at first, then growing stronger as warrior after warrior took up the sound. They were laughing at an enemy who thought terror was their greatest weapon, laughing at odds that were meant to crush hope, laughing because they had something their enemies could never understand, the absolute certainty that they stood on the right side of history. Gunnar's voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. Heckin' Blood Eagle, you speak of surrender to people who have never learned the word. Come and take what you can, if you have the strength. The challenge echoed across the valley, clear and unmistakable. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no quarter asked or given. This would be decided by steel and courage, by skill and determination, by everything that separated free people from those who served foreign masters. The shield wall tightened, each warrior feeling the presence of his brothers pressing close. The enemy force began to move forward, their confidence unshaken by defiant words. The battle for Ironhold had begun. The enemy charge began with the sound of 300 voices raised in a war cry that shook snow from the pine branches and sent ravens bursting from their roosts in startled clouds. But it was Gunnar's response that would be remembered in songs for generations to come. Not a shout of defiance, but something far more dangerous. The deliberate silence of a predator choosing its moment to strike. He stood motionless at the center of the shield wall as arrows began to fall around them like deadly rain. His pale eyes fixed on Heckin Blood Eagle, with the unwavering focus of a wolf marking its prey. The legendary warrior, who had never lost a battle, was about to face his greatest test. And Astrid could see in his bearing the absolute confidence of a man who had already chosen to die before he would yield. The first wave of attackers struck the eastern wall exactly where Gunnar had predicted, their ladders and grappling hooks finding purchase on defenses that appeared crumbling and weak. But as the enemy warriors climbed toward what they believed would be easy victory, the hidden truth of Ironhold's preparation revealed itself with devastating efficiency. Arrows whistled from concealed positions, finding gaps in armor with the precision of hunters who had spent their lives putting meat on their families' tables. Boiling oil poured from hidden reservoirs, turning triumphant war cries into screams of agony. The caltrops scattered beneath the snow claimed their toll as charging warriors found their feet pierced by iron spikes that sent them tumbling into the path of their own comrades. But it was the psychological impact of the trap that proved most devastating. The enemy force had expected to find demoralized defenders cowering behind inadequate walls. Instead, they discovered a settlement that had turned every building, every alley, every carefully planned weak point into an instrument of destruction. Now, Gunnar's voice boomed across the battlefield as the enemy force bunched together in the killing ground, their superior numbers becoming a fatal disadvantage in the narrow space. For Ironhold! For freedom! The shield wall broke apart with practiced precision, each warrior knowing exactly where to go and what to do. This was not the desperate last stand their enemies had expected, but a coordinated battle plan executed by men who had spent 5 days preparing for this moment. Astrid watched from her position near the great hall as Gunnar carved his way through the enemy, ranks like a force of nature given human form. His war axe rose and fell with methodical precision, each blow claiming a life, each step forward driving deeper into the heart of the enemy formation. The stories told about him had not been exaggerated. If anything, they had failed to capture the terrible beauty of his skill in battle, but even legends could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And Astrid saw the moment when the tide began to turn against them. More enemy warriors poured over the walls, their initial shock giving way to the grim determination of professional killers who had survived too many battles to be broken by a single setback. Young Bjorn Ironbeard fell with an arrow through his throat, his life's blood staining the snow crimson. Thorstein the smith took a spear thrust through his shoulder but continued fighting with his hammer in his left hand, his right arm hanging useless at his side. One by one, the defenders were being whittled away by an enemy force that could afford to trade lives at ruinous rates. It was then that Heckin Blood Eagle himself entered the battle, his massive frame cutting through the melee like a ship's prow through storm waves. His target was unmistakable, the legendary warrior whose presence had transformed what should have been a massacre into a genuine battle, Gunnar Half-Grave. Hakon's voice boomed across the battlefield, audible even over the clash of weapons and the cries of wounded men. "Face me if you dare. Let us settle this as warriors should." The challenge echoed across the settlement, and for a moment the battle seemed to pause as fighters on both sides turned to witness what would surely be an epic confrontation. Two legends of warfare, two men whose names were spoken in whispers around winter fires, about to determine the fate of everything Astrid held dear. Gunnar stepped forward into the circle that had spontaneously formed around the two champions, his war axe gleaming with the blood of fallen enemies. There was no fear in his bearing, no doubt or hesitation. This was what he had been born for, not the glory of victory, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who could not protect themselves. "I accept," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden stillness. "But know this, Hakon Blood Eagle, win or lose, you will remember this day for the rest of your life. You will remember that free people do not bow to tyrants, no matter what crown they serve." The two warriors began to circle each other like predators seeking advantage. Their weapons raised, their eyes locked in the kind of deadly focus that comes only to those who have walked the knife's edge between life and death so many times that they no longer fear the fall. The fate of Ironhold would be decided by single combat, and Astrid could only watch as the man she had come to love prepared to risk everything on one final throw of the dice. The single combat between Gunnar Half-Grave and Hakon Blood Eagle lasted less than 5 minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours in Astrid's perception, each clash of weapons echoing through her soul like hammer blows on an anvil. She watched from the steps of the great hall as two legends of warfare tested themselves against each other, their movements so swift and deadly that lesser men could barely follow the action. Hakon was everything his reputation claimed: massive, brutal, and skilled with an axe that had claimed more lives than plague or famine. But as the combat progressed, Astrid began to see the difference between a man who fought for gold and glory and one who fought for love and honor. Gunnar's every move was precise, economical, driven by purpose rather than rage. Where Hakon sought to dominate through overwhelming force, Gunnar fought with the patience of a master craftsman, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Hakon overextended himself in a mighty swing that would have split an oak tree, leaving himself momentarily vulnerable. Gunnar's counterstrike was swift as lightning and twice as devastating, his war axe finding the gap between helmet and mail with surgical precision. Hakon Blood Eagle fell like a toppled mountain, his weapon spinning away across the blood-stained snow. The silence that followed was deeper than death itself. 300 enemy warriors stared at the impossible sight of their invincible leader lying motionless in the snow, while the 37 defenders of Ironhold, now reduced to barely 20, still capable of fighting, stood ready to resume the battle if necessary. But something had changed in the enemy force. The certainty that had driven them forward was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that they had been led into a trap by commanders who had underestimated their prey. Without Hakon's leadership and the promise of easy victory, the coalition began to fracture like ice under spring sun. "Who speaks for you now?" Gunnar called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield despite the exhaustion that marked every line of his body. "Who will take responsibility for this unprovoked attack on free people?" A Danish nobleman stepped forward from the enemy ranks, his fine armor marking him as one of Harald Bluetooth's representatives. But there was uncertainty in his bearing now, the kind of doubt that comes to men who suddenly realize they may have to explain failure to a king. "We came under royal command," the Dane said, his accent thick but his words clear. "Harald Bluetooth has claimed dominion over these territories. Then Harald Bluetooth can come and claim them himself," Gunnar replied, leaning heavily on his axe as he fought to remain standing. "But he will find the same reception that awaits all who mistake free people for sheep to be herded." The political implications were staggering. By defeating Hakon in single combat, Gunnar had not only saved Ironhold, but potentially disrupted the entire Danish conquest strategy. Word of this victory would spread throughout the northern territories, inspiring resistance and proving that the Danish forces were not invincible. The enemy withdrawal began slowly, then gathered momentum as units that had been held together only by the promise of easy plunder decided that discretion was preferable to continued slaughter. Within an hour, the valley was empty except for the dead and the handful of enemy wounded who had been too badly hurt to retreat. True to her word, Astrid tended those wounded enemies with the same care she gave to her own people, earning surprised gratitude from men who had expected only death at the hands of their captors. Several of these warriors, farmers and fishermen pressed into service against their will, chose to remain in Ironhold rather than return to lords who had used them as expendable assets. The new clan banner that flew above the Great Hall 3 days later combined the symbols of both Astrid's and Gunnar's houses. The wolf of Kolrun intertwined with the raven of Askelson, united beneath the ancient symbol of the Tree of Life that represented growth, strength, and endurance. Jarl Magnus had performed the marriage ceremony himself, his ancient voice strong as he spoke words that bound two souls together, not just in love, but in the shared purpose of protecting what they had built together. "I never thought to see such a day," the old Jarl confided to Astrid as they watched Gunnar directing the repair of the settlement's defences. A warrior of his legendary status choosing to settle down, to build rather than simply conquer. Astrid smiled, her hand resting on her belly where new life had already begun to quicken. "He told me once that a man's worth is measured not by the enemies he defeats, but by what he is willing to sacrifice for those who cannot protect themselves. He has found something worth protecting. The settlement that emerged from the ashes of battle was stronger than what had come before. United by shared struggle and the knowledge that they had faced the worst their enemies could offer and emerged victorious. The arrival of refugees from other settlements, people who had heard of Ironhold's victory and sought the protection of walls, defended by legendary warriors, brought new skills and fresh blood to the community. Gudrun the Hollow-Tongued was never seen again, presumably having fled to Danish territories where her treachery might find more welcome reception. But her betrayal had ultimately served a greater purpose, revealing the scope of the enemy threat and allowing Ironhold to prepare for what would otherwise have been a devastating surprise attack. As winter settled over the valley with its blanket of cleansing snow, Astrid often found herself standing on the walls where the battle had been fought, watching Gunnar train the younger warriors in the skills that had saved them all. He had found peace at last, not the peace of inaction, but the deeper satisfaction that comes to those who have found their true purpose in life. The legend of Gunnar Half-Grave would continue to grow in the telling, but the man himself had found something more valuable than fame, a home worth defending, a love worth cherishing, and the promise of children who would grow up free because their parents had been willing to pay the price of freedom. The story had come full circle, from accusation and shame to honor and redemption, proving that sometimes the darkest moments are merely the prelude to the brightest dawn.